On this edition of Independent Sources, can anything be done to address New York City's poverty disparity?
Without a middle class, strong middle class voting constituency, but also a lower income voting constituency, I don't think anything's going to happen.
And exploring the city's diversity through dining.
The level of business growth is really high, and it also means that, a small family business, recent immigrants, they're able to start because, instead of renting a full storefront, they're renting a third of one.
Those stories and more coming up on Independent Sources. Welcome to Independent Sources. I'm Zyphus Lebrun. A Census Bureau survey recently gave credence to that old adage about the rich getting richer. That report stated that of the 30 most populous cities in the U.S., New York has the highest disparity between rich and poor. It also reported that more than a fifth of New York City's population lives under the poverty line. In this election season, candidates are bandying about phrases like class warfare. But is anyone really taking the issue seriously? Or is it all just campaign rhetoric? I spoke with NYU professor Robert Hawkins about the city's poverty crisis. So, Robert, this recent report about the poverty disparity in New York, it's kind of telling us something we already knew a little bit about. But you as the expert, did it say anything to us that we may not have already known?
Well, I don't think there was a lot new in the report. We've known for years that there is a wide income gap. We've known for years that poverty continues to grow in New York City. And so there wasn't anything new there, I would say. It's good to be reminded, but it's also a disappointing report. I mean, we are coming out of the recession, which is good for the country, generally good for New York City. But there's a portion of our population for whom the recession is very much still a real thing. And unfortunately, it's not just a recession for them. It's a way of life. And that's the thing that's disappointing.
Now, is this the time, do you think that this is the time to really try to address the city's poverty problem?
Yes, because there's always that time. And this is a situation. New York City has a situation where it's actually losing its middle class, and we have people coming into the city barely able to make it. My kids have friends who live with their mom and dad, so they're a two-parent family. There are, let's say, 2 kids, and they're living in 2 bedrooms. We know there's one family who lives in 1 bedroom. And if you run into any of them on the street, you'd say, well, this is a middle class person. You'd think, well, both parents are working, they have a middle class job, but they can only afford a 1-bedroom apartment in New York City. And why is that normal? Why is that okay? It's not anywhere, nearly anywhere, outside of New York City, in the South, in the Midwest, on the West Coast. You don't have those situations, not with the middle class. And so we're losing our middle class. But when you start to lose your middle class, what does that mean? That means that the higher income folks are growing and the lower income folks are growing. So, and we have a situation where the lower income folks are growing at a higher rate than the higher income folks. So the middle class is disappearing. And if we don't start to pay attention to this increasing wealth gap, we're going to see more of that. And so with poverty comes more problems. And people will have many more concerns, not just education, not just crime, but looking for jobs. So you'll have situations where people have multiple jobs. And New York City is, for many people, is home. You don't want to leave home. So it's not so easy as saying, well, I'll just up and move to Jersey, or I'll move to Connecticut. It's not always easy for someone who made their life in New York City, and for someone who maybe they can't quite afford to make those moves. So this is a real concern that I'm not convinced the candidates are really paying attention to.
Can this be addressed, Robert? Because I mean, a lot of what you're saying is real, and a lot of what you're saying is like people face every day. But you know, is there the political will, and not only the political will, but you know, are there structures that probably exist now and kind of you know, that can address this, can help address this?
I am not convinced that the political will is there. And you know, I have students, and my students will tell you, I say this all the time, that, and I think I may have even said it on the show, that a politician's first job is to get elected, and their second job is to get reelected. So without the political base, without a strong middle class voting constituency, but also a lower income voting constituency, I don't think anything's going to happen. We may move the level here and there, but real change that we need in the city, I'm not optimistic about it.
Wow.
Which is too bad.
Right, that seems kind of bleak, because I mean, a lot of what we've been talking about, we've talked about this on the show before, and just, you know, articles and people talk about this disappearing middle class. Mm-hmm. So what happens, Robert? I mean, 10 years from now, when a one-bedroom apartment in downtown Brooklyn will cost anybody $1,600, $1,700. Is this a runaway train and we can't pull it back right now? Is that the case?
Well, you know, a former professor of mine, William Julius Wilson, wrote about this years ago in a book called When Work Disappears, and this is part of his work. When you look at poverty and how poverty develops in the city, the classic model actually didn't happen so quickly in New York the way it happened in Chicago and other places. But the classic model is that the jobs move out of the city, leaving behind what we have in New York City, or what we're starting to see in New York City, the very rich and the very poor. So when the jobs move out, that means the middle class moves out. And when the middle class moves out, that's where you start to see the concentrated poverty. So what we're going to see in New York that we probably won't see in Manhattan so much, but throughout the city, one of the things that we will start to see are more pockets of concentrated poverty. And what can be done about this is just really a reconceptualization of the tax system, of the school system, of what incentives we bring to businesses, but what incentives we bring to the middle class as well. What about some of those middle class tax breaks, which won't solve all the problems, but that are targeted more toward housing? I know the Bloomberg administration started providing housing, middle income housing for the city. And when I look at some of the buildings, I look at some of the apartments available, I'm like, what middle are you talking about?
Right. Where if I'm a middle class,
where is that middle?
Right. Because my salary puts me in the middle class, but then I can't afford.
You can't afford the affordable housing.
Right.
So we need to take a hard, long look at this and make some investments that I think for some people are going to be very scary. Make some investments that looks at the tax system, not just decreasing it or increasing taxes, but really focusing and experimenting with the tax base. Mayors can only do so much. Mayors can only work within a certain bubble, a certain box. But we've got to start to think outside of that box. And New York will find itself in a place that looks like Detroit. I don't want to get that bleak. That's pretty bleak.
Right. Yeah.
That's pretty bleak. But if we think about it, it can follow the same pattern. And what we'll say, if you're watching the show, what you'll say is that that's not happening that can't happen in Manhattan. And maybe it won't happen in Manhattan, but it'll start to happen in neighborhoods, and it'll start to happen in Brooklyn and parts of Queens. Look very, very carefully at when we break things down by neighborhood, and we start to see Detroit. If we just look at Manhattan, it you know, it is still the Big Apple.
Right, it's still the crown jewel,
It's
but
still the
everywhere
crown
else,
jewel.
yeah.
But take a hard, long look at some of the different neighborhoods, and what you start to see are the patterns that took place in Detroit.
Oh wow, Robert, really, really good conversation. But I'm gonna have to cut us off here, and hopefully,
It's so
maybe
short.
I know. Hopefully, we can carry this conversation on at another time. But I really appreciate you coming in. Thank you so much, Robert.
Thank you. Thank you.
Still to come, a controversy over an effort to get more black women to breastfeed. Before that, Abby Ishola has some other news.
Thanks, Zyphus. Here's a look at some headlines from the ethnic and community media. Food market workers in the Bronx are at odds with the city's Business Integrity Commission over the agency's anti-mafia crusade. El Diario La Prensa reports that the commission has asked workers in Hunts Point to fill out an 11-page questionnaire. This is in an effort to support the agency's plans to eradicate the influence of the mob in the new Fulton Street Fish Market area. The survey requires information such as names, addresses of ex-spouses, where they spend their vacations, and other personal tidbits. Many workers are refusing to fill out the document because they say it's an invasion of privacy. But those who decline face steep fines. There are growing questions as to who Orthodox and non-Orthodox Jewish voters will support during the upcoming mayoral election. There's particular concern about whether those who backed Bill Thompson in the primaries will vote for Bill de Blasio or go with Republican Joe Lhota. Adam Dichter of the Jewish Week says many prominent voters he's spoken to are now undecided on whether to vote Democrat or Republican. A recent poll found that though most Jews are Democrats, those in New York have proven to be undecidedly nonpartisan in the past, backing Republicans like Rudy Giuliani and Mayor Bloomberg. City Limits reports that though the city bike plan has been successful, there's a lack of diversity in the demographics of riders. The city bike program attracted 80,000 members in its first 3 months, exceeding its target of 60,000 for the first year. The project director of NYC Bike Share, Justin Ginsburg, says the early success is a result of high diversity of bike locations. But most of the riders are reportedly white men who live in households with six-figure incomes. Ginsburg says they hope to target low-income communities that would benefit from the low-cost transportation, but the $95 yearly cost for the bike may still prove to be too much for the city's poorer residents. And finally, from the Irish Voice, Irish residents affected by Hurricane Sandy have been honored through a work of art. California-based Irish sculptor Linda Buckner designed a sculpture that was recently unveiled at the American Irish Historical Society. Dr. Kevin Cahill, President General of the organization, says his goal was to honor the strength of the American Irish, not the devastation. The organization is also developing a written and oral account of what happened after speaking to victims of the storm and emergency responders. Those were just a few stories from the ethnic and immigrant media. Independent Sources will be back right after this.
Thanks for staying tuned. Studies have shown that breastfeeding is one of the most effective ways of creating a bond between mother and child, as well as passing along some of the woman's protective antibodies to her baby. However, there are millions of women who don't breastfeed, and some experts believe this may be at the heart of a spike in childhood illnesses. I sat down with Kimberly Seals-Allers, the founder of the website mochamanual.com. We talked about why it's important for women to breastfeed and why her campaign geared towards black women drew some racist comments. Kimberly, thank you for joining us in studio today.
Thank you for having me.
Great. So let's talk a little bit about breastfeeding. Why is it so important for mothers to breastfeed newborns?
Well, it's really important because, first of all, there's so many preventative health benefits that breast milk provides for children. So we know that breastfed babies have a reduced risk of type 2 diabetes. They have reduced risk of upper respiratory infections. Now there's so many studies showing the link between breastfeeding and reduced risk of childhood obesity. So we see so many benefits. Plus, there's benefits to mom. You know, I don't like to leave her out of the conversation. And there are so many studies that show that there are certain cancers that women have reduced risk of, particularly African-American women with a reduced risk of breast cancer, also ovarian cancer. So, I mean, breastfeeding is good for everybody.
Now, I know that you're very involved in promoting breastfeeding in the African-American community. Why is it so important for African American children to be breastfed? Is there a particular reason for that?
Well, the main issue from where I look at it is really about infant mortality. We know in this nation, black infants die at twice the rate of white babies. So we have so many children who aren't making it to their first birthday. Mostly that's because they're born too small, too sick, or too soon. And those babies need breast milk the most. So the CDC has repeatedly said that if we can increase the rates of breastfeeding among black women, particularly amongst these premature babies, that we can really save lives and that the infant mortality rate could be reduced by as much as 50%. That's significant. So we're really talking about, in many instances, a real life or death situation. Plus, we know that some of the things that breastfeeding helps reduce the risk of are rampant in our community. I didn't talk about asthma, again, a big thing, SIDS, very common in our community. So many things that we have a higher risk of, either as infants or as children, can be reduced by increased breastfeeding. So it's really, on one level, for babies who are born too small, too sick, or too soon, a life-saving measure, and it's a health imperative for us in our community, because if we have healthier children, that leads to healthy adults, and that's what we want for everybody.
Mm-hmm. But so you're talking about all these wonderful benefits to breastfeeding, but there are certainly a large number of African American, as well as just women who do not breastfeed. Mm-hmm. Why is that the case? I guess particularly in the African American community, do women not breastfeed as much as they need to?
Right. So it's so complex. I mean, there are many layers. I spent a lot of time researching and talking about it. But one thing I want to start with saying is, in general, women across the board aren't breastfeeding as much, but we see this as particularly acute in the African American community. We can look at some broader issues, such as the over-sexualization of the breast. We know in this country it is perfectly acceptable to use breasts to sell chicken wings and beer, but if people see a woman feeding their baby, they're uncomfortable, right? So we have that absurdity that a lot of people deal with, and that's even more complex in our community when we look at how black women's bodies have been viewed, used, stereotyped in the past. So that's something that we hear a lot of. Another thing that we know, there's been very aggressive infant formula marketing, particularly in low-income communities. And so it's confusing because a lot of women feel that formula is as good because that's what they've been sold in terms of a marketing message, but we know that is not true. Also, we know that in the 1940s, the infant formula marketers did a good job at convincing people that, I think their slogan was a substance for sophisticates. And so if you had money, you bought formula. That was the lifestyle they promoted. And in the black community, like several other immigrant communities, they like to show they've arrived. And so to be able to purchase formula was a sign of showing that you were not poor. In fact, when I was breastfeeding my children, I had an older relative who I respect very much and love very dearly, who said to me, breastfeeding is for poor people. So there's a very common idea that if you have money, you buy formula. But again, that completely negates the health benefits.
Now, one of the things that kind of stood a little controversy was that you had proposed a breastfeeding week for African Americans, and there were African American women.
Yes.
And there was a bit of a kickback.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I was confused by that. August is National Breastfeeding Awareness Month. It begins with World Breastfeeding Week. So it's a whole month around breastfeeding awareness. I propose that we take 1 week out of the whole month to really talk about this specific group, mostly for those factors that, again, it's for many babies a life-saving measure. We know that there are health issues that are running rampant in our community. This is leading children to have compromised attendance at school. I mean, the knock-on effects of poor health as an infant and child can be a whole nother show, right? So when we were talking about taking a minute to talk to this particular group, and I also want to say that for over 40 years, there's been this racial disparity in breastfeeding rates, whereas at 6 months and 12 months, the rates for breastfed babies is 50% less. So it is really a gaping hole, and it's been there for over 40 years. So this isn't a new thing. This isn't something that we just made up. The numbers don't lie. So I propose that we kind of spend a week just talking specifically to this group, and really for us to do it amongst ourselves. Like, this would be a by us, for us initiative. So the backlash was very surprising because we didn't really ask anything for anybody else, but there was an idea that if we isolate our messaging, that we're excluding others, and that wasn't at all what the case was. We're welcoming people to join us in the conversation, but we also know that there are unique issues in our community that we know that we can speak to, that we can address, and we wanted 7 days to do that, and I'm not really sure why that bothered people.
So for now, this in the back, what's next for you and your push to bring awareness to this issue in the African American community?
Well, we're just thinking about all the ways we can get to more moms. We want to show that breastfeeding is for everybody. We want to shift the cultural norm. We want to change the narrative. We don't want people saying the black women don't breastfeed. We want people to say black women do breastfeed, and we want to show that because it is happening, you know? And I think that also we want to battle the stereotypes within our community. So like sometimes when, if you see like an Erykah Badu type, you know, perhaps our sisters who are more Afrocentric, we would expect them to breastfeed, right? So we think it's a lifestyle. But perhaps when people see me and I'm chemically dependent and I like my meat with my meat, like I tell people, and I'm usually in high heels, people don't think that I'm a breastfeeder, but I am and I have been. So we want to start showing that all types of women breastfeed. So that's really what we're about, is sparking a cultural shift. There will be another Black Breastfeeding Week next year. Hopefully there'll be less backlash, but we're prepared for it, and we're here to help babies and mothers. That's our primary goal.
Well, thank you so very much, Kimberly Seals-Alice, for joining us on our show.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
When we come back, experiencing ethnic food and getting an education at the same time. And finally, from us, exploring New York's diversity through dining. Streetwise New York gives tours of the city's ethnic communities with a focus on cuisine. Sarah Pizon recently took the Queen's leg of the tour and filed this report.
New York City is one of the most famous cultural melting pots in the world. Its increase in immigrant population makes it truly unique. One way to see that is to come here in Jackson Heights, Queens, with Streetwise New York. Squeezing 90 years of culture and history into a 3-hour food tour isn't an easy task, but that's what Andrew Silverstein and his friend Dan Shaky are trying to do in this diverse ethnic community.
As I mentioned before, this is the most diverse county in the United States, and this is the most diverse part of Queens that we're standing in right now. People from Latin America, Colombia, Ecuador, Mexico. You got people from South Asia, even East Asia, you know, Chinese, Korean around here.
The tour started as a collaboration with the public radio and web program, Feet in Two Worlds. It was a special project for the International Association of Culinary Professional Conference in New York City. The demand has grown since then, and now tours are offered 3 to 4 times a week in Brooklyn, the Lower East Side, and Queens. The Queens tour begins here, in a Nepali dumpling place located in the back of an AT&T store.
So what they're doing is they're making momos, which are basically like dumplings, and they're making them fresh and they're steaming them.
When Andrew Silverstein began the tour 2 years ago, there was only 1 or 2 places selling Nepali mumus. Today, there are more than 14.
It means, you know, the level of business growth is really high, and it also means that, you know, a small family business, recent immigrants, they're able to start because, you know, instead of renting a full storefront, they're renting a third of one.
Businesses here are flourishing, like this Colombian bakery selling pan de bono, a kind of bread mixed with cheese and served at breakfast.
The original owner, he was making the bread out of his house, just selling it by word of mouth. It got really popular. He started working in the back of somebody else's shop, and eventually he opened up his own bakery.
Not everyone has such a success story. It's been a rough going for this Mexican food cart owner who sells elote, a corn covered in cheese and mayonnaise.
But these days it's really hard for a recent immigrant to get their permit. People buy on the black market permits up to $20,000 a year to have their cards. They have vending license, right? They don't have as the permit for their cart. So they do this at the risk of being fined.
The tour isn't just a culinary experience. It also teaches about the struggles this vibrant neighborhood faces, like overcrowding in apartments that can lead to fire hazards.
The most dangerous thing around here is that a lot of families, a lot of buildings will convert the basement. If you're living in the basement, you only have one exit. And if there is a fire, if that one exit gets blocked, then you know, people are done for.
And immigrant abuse.
Given the immigration system in our country, a lot of people who come here, they're forced to come here undocumented, and you know, people get taken advantage of. Women are then forced into you know, prostitution. They're tricked to come here. They're victims of human trafficking.
This tour is an eye-opener, even for native New Yorkers like Shamya Kata.
I'm a native New Yorker. You know, I am born and bred, but I don't know a lot of these neighborhoods at all. You know, New York has so many different cultures all over, and it's like, you know, being exposed without having to travel.
The tour participants surely didn't have to travel to Mexico to try this special taco mixto. They found this famous food cart under the elevated 7 train on Roosevelt Avenue. Here, it's not about chicken or beef. It's about pig's ears and cow's tongue.
It's good. I'm not burning. I'm not on fire. There's a good taste.
Does it
to
taste like ears and tongue?
Mm-hmm.
It tasted like a combination of like a steak and a liver, but a little bit more of a like a harder texture.
So how does Andrew Silverstein discover these hidden gems?
Wait, where do you get your secret?
Where are the secrets? Yeah, I mean, a lot of it's being out there, talking to people. Sure, you know, there's a lot of places more so are being in the newspaper, on the web. But, you know, I don't bring people to a place until I've tried it myself, right?
Yeah, very good. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Sarah Pizan, Independent Sources.
That was a really fun piece, Sarah. Tell me a little bit about these guys, Silverstein and Shaky, was it?
Right, they're 2 actual New Yorkers, and they've been doing this for a while. They were actually just giving tours prior to this, just for fun, and then one day decided to really cater, kind of customized tour in, you know, the boroughs of New York City. And Dan Shake is actually a comedian, and Andrew Silverstein is getting his Ph.D. in economics at CUNY.
Mm-hmm. Now you looked like you had a lot of fun on there. You know, tell me a little bit about the other foods that we didn't see. We saw some Mexican food that you had, but some of the foods that we didn't see.
I couldn't include everything because it's a 3-hour tour, so there's a lot to see. In my 3-hour tour, I saw about 6 to 7 places, and we tried all kinds of different food. What I didn't include in the piece is we actually went to an Indian supermarket called Patel Brothers, and it's wonderful. They have all these you know, fresh produce and Indian spices. They have like over 100 kinds of different rice and beans, and it's just, I mean, it's fabulous. And one interesting thing I tried there was actually Lay's potato chips. There's Lay's potato chips called Indian's Magic Masala, and they have these really fun, it has cumin inside, turmeric, dried mango powder. I mean, it's something really unusual that usually these Lay's potato chips are only for the Indian market, you know, South Asian market, and so they get them imported to New York City for people here, so that was pretty cool to see. Another thing we saw was we went to try very special Indian sweets and snacks at this place called Rajbagh. And Rajbagh is basically, it's a family business that was started about 2 decades ago. And it's a success story. These, you know, Indian immigrants came, and this family opened up this little shop where they would have snacks and sweets. And over, you know, 2 decades later, they have Rajbaghs all over the country. Anybody can start their own Rajbagh anywhere. They also cater to all of the Indian flights. They make all the food for flights from, you know, New York to India. And it's incredible. Oh,
that's wonderful. Now, the big question, how much would this tour cost me if I wanted to go out there?
The tour are actually kind of pricey. A 3-hour tour costs about $250 per person. And they actually do also 6-hour tours, which are about $350 as well.
Oh, wow. Wow, and they still get a good crowd, huh?
They do. They said they give about 3 to 4 tours a week, you know, with about 6 to 8 people. So, you know, their business is doing pretty well, I'd say.
Thank you, Sarah. Really, really great piece.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us this week. Till next time, be independent-minded.